At the beginning of the 1800s, the major settled regions of America was caught up in a huge religious movement. These Protestant revivals that became known as the Second Great Awakening created a tremendous amount of energy that resulted in a number of reform movements that affected our cultural, social, and moral aspects of our life. We're standing here today by the statue of Aidan Ballou, the leader of probably one of the most successful of all the communal living experiments, the Hopedale Commune, home of the practical Christian socialists. Here in the Blackstone Valley, with our strong ties to Roger Williams and William Blackstone, we were much more open to dissenting views on religion, unlike our Puritan brethren to the north. We were receptive to different aspects of how to live our religious lives. And that's one of the reasons why the Hopedale Commune lasted so long. It's also one of the reasons why abolitionist movement was so strong here in the Blackstone Valley. And that's our topic for today, the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad in the Blackstone Valley. You see, this was a period of tremendous change. The great transportation revolution was taking hold. The building of canals, steam engines, railroads, and turnpikes created a whole new aspect to our lives we could not have imagined from before. At the same time, many of us were striving to live a good Christian life and finding ways to live our religious convictions. Reformers were preaching to turn away from sin and sinful habits and to work hard to eliminate sin from society. This generated a tremendous amount of reforms: temperance, spiritualism, education, women's rights, and finally, the abolition of slavery. The abolition of slavery was an important aspect to most New Englanders, for we had just fought a costly revolution against an oppressive English king. And the Constitution that declared all men were created equal rubbed us the wrong way in light of an institution known as slavery, where many men and women were still in bondage. The peculiar institution just had to go, and the abolitionist movement was very firm in making sure New Englanders could not turn their back on what was happening south of the border. So today we're going to talk about the abolitionist movement, the Underground Railroad and how it worked. And finally, an incident that happened in Boston that had enormous repercussions in Worcester, the whole country felt. By the 1830s, the world was rapidly changing. England had eliminated slavery back in 1807, and it had been stripped from all the northern states for some time now. But that peculiar institution was still an integral part of the southern lifestyle and the southern economy. With rapid westward expansion and new states requesting admittance to the Union at a rapid pace, the question of what to do about slavery was becoming more persistent and needed to be addressed. And the abolitionists were there to address it. They were a persistent lot, even driven. They used any tool at their disposal. Education or moral indignation, they didn't care. They'd speak to large audiences or small. They'd use their newspapers to talk about the horrors of slavery. Anything at their command to make sure people understood the real horrors of that institution. But let's hear about slavery and their efforts in their own words.
In Grafton, Massachusetts, I was alone, and there was neither house, hall, church, nor marketplace in which I could speak to the people. But, determined to speak, I went to the hotel and borrowed a dinner bell, with which in hand I passed through the principal streets, ringing the bell and crying out, "Notice! Frederick Douglass, recently a slave, will lecture on American slavery on Grafton Common this evening at 7 o'clock. Those who would like to hear the workings of slavery by one of the slaves are respectfully invited to attend." This notice brought out a large audience, after which the largest church in town was open to me. Frederick Douglass, 1841.
You have heard Frederick Douglass, now free, speak himself, but his mother and sisters are still in the hands of the outragers. It is, therefore, fit that I, a woman, should stand by his side and bear testimony in favor of the cause which, under God, would make them free. Abby Kelly, 1841.
I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. No, no. Tell a man whose home is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which he has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. William Lloyd Garrison, 1831.
Now, there's no question that the abolitionists were on the fringe, even the extreme edge of American thought prior to the Civil War. And yet it's hard to imagine women in their Quaker gray creating such a ruckus that they'd be pelted with rotten eggs and forced to leave their speaking halls through the back door. And yet during the constitutional crisis in Rhode Island in the 1840s, this was a common occurrence for abolitionists trying to preach the evils of slavery to the masses. Now, just how effective was the abolitionist movement? Let's catch up with Edwin Bars, the chief historian for the National Park Service, and learn a little bit more about the effectiveness of the abolitionist movement.
Actually, abolitionists at first had very little influence. They were looked as far out. They bothered the Southerners. They bothered many people in the North that weren't worried about the great social problem in the United States. But William Lloyd Garrison, in his Liberator, calling burning the Constitution, he did not hit well even with many fellow Northerners who realized that slavery was a problem. But with the John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry, the seizure of the arsenal and the armory at Harper's Ferry, it put a different light. The Virginia governor probably made the biggest mistake any politician ever did. He decided to try Brown for inciting a servile insurrection and murder rather than send him to an institution. And Brown, whether knowingly or not, when he left on his raid, left in the Kennedy farmhouse, his base 6 miles from Harper's Ferry, left correspondence linking him to Amos Lawrence and others leaders of the abolitionist movement in Massachusetts. This, to the Southerners, it looked like these abolitionists were inciting servile insurrection. It would be like Santo Domingo in the South. Also, Brown, when they brought him to trial, put the whole institution on trial, not just Brown. And there was they began to build a groundswell of sympathy for Brown in the North. And to the Southerners, it appeared that abolitionists had a lot more support. And it could be said to be the clarion call on the step that led to the secession of South Carolina and the firing on Fort Sumter. Is this ferment stirred up and started by the abolitionists of Massachusetts, reaching out into the Blackstone River Valley, and its long tradition dating to the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad becomes very important. There was the feeling of the abolitionists and others having like sympathies but not being as overt, that they would assist blacks in escaping from the slave states, escaping to Canada. Because in Canada, while Her Majesty's government would extradite you if you were guilty of a crime. You would not be, once you reached Canada, if you were if you were escaped slave, they would not return you. There's a great sectional crisis in 1850. California is going to be admitted to the Union. The Southerners, up till that time, from 1820 to 1850, when a state comes into the Union, there will be one slave and one free. When California comes into the Union, there is no counterbalancing slave state to come in. So there is this great sectional crisis. And they work out a compromise. Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John Calhoun, these men who had dominated the United States Senate. Now the compromise is that California is going to come in as a free state. But the Southerners are going to insist on enforcement of the fugitive slave law. Federal enforcement it is. So that will mean that, just like in Prohibition, that the federal government will be involved in apprehending blacks escaping along the Underground Railroad. Now this would be safe houses, safe barns, safe fields, as they work their way north. And of course, it is a federal offense to aid and abet these blacks escaping. Like an income tax, there is a bonus for turning people in. There will be riots at several places when the law enforcement people will arrest a black man, black woman, as they escape along the Underground Railroad, preparatory to sending them back to bondage. And there'll be several riots in which the people, since people in Massachusetts particularly, people in the Blackstone Valley, will take action outside the law to release from custody blacks who have been apprehended preparatory to be sent back to bondage. So the Underground Railroad is very significant in this area. The Underground Railroad extended from almost any place you can that you could escape north into Canada. And this would be a natural route northward from Providence, the seaport, and railroad passing through here. Before the railroad, the canal, and the natural line of communication northward from Providence to Worcester and on northward.
Allowing by law slave owners and their agents to carry off or kidnap runaway slaves was a real eye-opener to the people of New England. Massachusetts actually enacted laws preventing their officers from assisting in the recovery of runaway slaves, basically telling the slave owner, you chose the United States as an assistant in the recovery of your slaves, well then let the United States capture and hold them. Massachusetts will not dirty its hands in such vile business. Now there were two major incidents, one in Boston and one in Worcester, that when linked together ended the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. Let's join our colleagues in the National Park Service at the Boston African American National Historic Site and learn more about the capture of Anthony Burns.
Here we are in Smith Court. Actually, Smith Court looks pretty close now to the way it used to look in the mid-1800s when this place was buzzing. You know, the centerpiece of the court is, of course, the African Meeting House, the oldest standing black church in the United States. And not only that, but I like to say that the African Meeting House stands as a tribute to that free black community that lived here on Beacon Hill, that was organized, that was motivated, that pretty much determined their own destiny once you got here. You know, this is a big lesson in community, and people came here not only to go to church, but they came here to talk about political issues. I mean, the biggest issue of the time was, of course, the fugitive slave law and slavery in the United States, and what was this state, what was Boston, what was the country going to do about this issue?
The Fugitive Slave Law was reinforcing the institution of slavery, making it possible for slave owners to send posses to the north to retrieve runaway contraband, fugitive slaves, or what have you. And it is here in Beacon Hill where they met the most resistance.
Yeah, what a time that must have been. You can imagine that slave catchers are coming up to Boston all the time, knowing that there are runaway slave ships. I guess black people had been sneaking away to Boston for 40, 50 years now. And it was up to this neighborhood to make sure that the people knew where the slave catchers were, when they were here, and how to escape in case they came. I mean, there's a whole system of alleys that wanders around in the backs of these buildings. And these are all places that, people really had to be aware of. And it was an exciting time. It was a very dangerous time. The last major case was the Anthony Burns case. And that was the big time that the whole city of Boston sent this message, not just the black community, not even just the white, not even just the abolitionist community, but the entire city said that, we're not going to tolerate this. And the whole city was affected by this. Anthony Burns, who was accused of having robbed a jewelry store, and they brought him into jail on these trumped up charges of breaking and entering into a jewelry store. And then, wouldn't you know that as soon as he gets to jail, he meets Deputy Marshal Asa Butman, who wanted to capture Anthony Burns and take him back to Virginia.
He was a mark. And they had something to prove with Anthony Burns. They had something to prove because they wanted to show not only the people here in Beacon Hill, but the rest of the United States that they weren't going to mess around with the laws that governed the land, and that we better uphold these laws. So in the face of that, they called in all the militia possible. And Charles, you want
Yeah, I mean, what it was the President Pierce decided that he had learned the hard way from the last 3 or 4 times, that you had had people revolting against slaves being captured. You had had their marshals have been killed at the State House before. They didn't want this to happen again, so he sends 1,000 federal troops. If you can imagine 1,000 people new to Boston marching into Boston, and then hires, another 1,000 of this extra militia,
paramilitary units, whomever
these
he
people,
could
some of
find.
these people are thugs. They have prison records. I mean,
Anybody
they're just
walking.
pulling people together here,
Warm bodies.
to make sure that Anthony Burns is going to be returned to Virginia, and at which point the city just shuts down. I mean, if you're walking down Cambridge Street, the main thoroughfares where you had all the commerce here, they're hanging black crepes in front of their windows, in front of all the glass, and I mean, this was a time when people were really, really upset with the federal government. And actually, they do take Anthony Burns. They march him down to the wharf, and he gets on a ferry. And, adding insult to injury, the band that accompanies them starts playing Carry Me Back to Old Virginia. Now, the crowd, to tell you about Boston, the crowd starts screaming, shame, shame, shame. I mean, the city here really let people know that they weren't going to tolerate slavery, that they weren't going to tolerate the Fugitive Slave Law. Well, no, it became clear that if you were a slave catcher, Boston was not the safe place to be, and that this was a town that was not going to let you get away with these things.
They had something to prove, and they proved it. I'm Bernadette Williams, Supervisory Park Ranger, Boston African American National Historic Site.
And I'm Charles Taylor. I'm another park ranger here at Boston African American. Thanks.
To the abolitionists, who were by and large non-resistors, non-violent pacifists, the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act was indeed a huge moral dilemma for them. For in fact, there may be some causes where violence is justified. The moral reforms of the Great Awakening had come face to face with the harsh realities of a secular world. Now it's a few months later, it's October of 1854. Let's journey to the city of Worcester, known for its abolitionist sympathies, and catch up with park rangers Jack Whitaker and Walt Stockwell and continue with our story.
So Jack, I understand there was an incident right here in Worcester that involved this U.S. Marshal Butman. What do you know about that?
Well, the attempt to save Anthony Burns in Boston, a failure of course, really upset the abolitionists here in the state, particularly the group from Worcester that made the trip all the way into Boston to no avail at all.
Yeah.
So they vowed that it wasn't going to happen again. And vigilance committees were formed throughout the state, one of the more active ones right here in Worcester. And at one point, when Asa Butman, the marshal, arrived in Worcester, they were ready for him. They assumed that there was a target, and they picked one man who had been here in Worcester for 12 years. He was a fugitive slave, left Virginia 12 years before, and been living a prosperous and quiet life here in Worcester. His name was William Jenkins. Now, can you tell me anything about William Jenkins?
Yeah, William Jenkins, as you say, he had been here for 12 years. He had escaped from bondage, moved to Worcester, had settled down. The Worcester Almanac had him listed as a barber, and he worked at the Central Hotel, or I think it was the Central Street Hotel right here in Worcester. Being a barber, he got to shave and give haircuts to a lot of prominent citizens here in Worcester. So he must have known a lot of very important people. He probably was looked to for advice. I think barbers ranked just below ministers in the black community because they did give this advice and counsel to people. So he was quite a well-known man, I would say, here in Worcester.
So the abolitionists here in Worcester would have known him and been very eager to protect him from Asa Butman.
Yes.
I understand as Asa moved into the American Temperance House, it was a hotel here in Worcester.
Yeah, yeah.
That immediately a group of men, about 50 strong, black and white, arrived, and they were going to make Asa's stay a short one and a lively one if they could do anything about it. So they raised quite a ruckus outside the American Temperance House. But Asa was a hard man to scare, and he came to the door brandishing a revolver. Well, this was all the Vigilance Committee needed. He was a flagrant violation of the law, flaunting a pistol. They had him arrested, and he was jailed. The next morning, on the way to court, there was an even bigger mob, screaming and shouting as Asa was brought into the courtroom. The courtroom was bedlam, and Asa began to think better of the deal and decided that he would leave Worcester. He promised he would leave Worcester and never come back again. The abolitionists, led by George Hoare and Stephen Foster, who is the husband of Abby Kelly, immediately turned to the crowd and said, "We've won, we've won." They praised them for the work they had done and said, "We've saved a slave, and the slave catcher is leaving town." But Asa's day wasn't over quite yet. I think there were more things to happen to him. Tell us about that, would you?
Yeah, it's interesting. The way I heard the story, as these speeches and all were going on, the crowd was listening to them. At the same time, 4 or 5 black men had broken into the marshal's office where Butman was being held, and they started to beat on him. And it wasn't too long before they were found out, and Stephen Foster came in and I guess saved him from a worse fate. And they decided right then and there they better get this guy out of town. So they said, let's bring him to the railroad station. And they proceeded through the crowd, being pelted with eggs and whatever else they could find. The whole group was all going still. They wanted this man. Well, what happened when they got to the railroad station, the train had already left for Boston, so here's more trouble for Marshal Butman. So at that point, Stephen Foster decided we better get him out of here. So they hired a carriage and they took him to Boston by way of Westboro, probably never to be seen in Worcester again.
Well, for Stephen Foster, this was quite a day. You figure he was a man who was an avid abolitionist against slavery. In addition, he was kind of a forerunner of the Gandhi and Martin Luther King school of nonviolent resistance. And to have freed a slave, or not freed a slave, but saved a freed slave, and had a slave catcher run out of town without being seriously harmed. He wasn't killed, and that mob could have killed him, was quite an accomplishment for him. Asa Butman, his name would go on in history, even long after Asa was around. This incident in Worcester was referred to in the history books as the Butman riot. And it was the last attempt to enforce the fugitive slave law here in Massachusetts. So that the outcome was that the Vigilance Committee, the abolitionists, had won this one. Massachusetts never again was required to break the fugitive slave law, and a freed slave remained here in Worcester, and a slave catcher was driven out of town.
Good story.
Good story. Well, this is Jack Whitaker.
And this is Walt Stockwell, Park Rangers with the Blackstone Valley National Heritage Corridor.
See you around the river.
Who would have thought that a Quaker farm girl who was much more at home driving a team of horses would become the leading female abolitionist of her time? Far more radical than her contemporaries on such issues as temperance, slavery, non-resistance, and suffrage for both blacks and women, Abby Kelly was a leader, quiet persistence and with a very strong voice.
Abby Kelly was the most untiring and most persecuted of all the women who labored throughout the anti-slavery struggle. She traveled up and down, alike in winter's cold and summer's heat, with scorn, ridicule, violence, and mobs accompanying her, suffering all kinds of persecution, still speaking whenever and wherever she gained an audience, in the open air, in schoolhouse, barn, depot, church, or public hall, on weekday or Sunday as she found opportunity. Frederick Douglass.
Now today we're standing at Liberty Farm in Worcester. Another important function of the farm here, the Fosters used it as a way station for the Underground Railroad. Now it wasn't something you would hear about in town. The Fosters never commented on any of their abolitionist Underground Railroad activities. But it wasn't uncommon to see slaves wandering around these farm grounds, getting their strength back for their push north to Canada. Matter of fact, one of the stories that's been passed down is Alla, Abby's daughter, was found on the front porch by some visitors who were coming to see her mother, helping a slave learn how to read. There's one story in particular that stands out that gives you a good indication of just the type of character Abby Kelly had. She had just been on extensive speaking engagement throughout upstate New York. She returned to Worcester tired. It was 1851, and the Women's National Convention was being held here in Worcester. And Abby attended that convention with no real goal of speaking. However, she became upset when many of the women were very well dressed, very affluent, very selfish views, and there were no anti-slavery resolutions being offered. And she felt compelled to take the floor. And she stood up and she said, "I did not rise up to make a speech. My life has been a speech. For 14 years, I've lived the cause in every aspect of my life. Bloody feet, sisters, have worn smooth the path you trod." The bloody feet speech became a metaphor for the women's rights movement, a reminder of all the female pioneers in the past who had made their way forward. All from a modest Quaker background, quiet farm girl who believed that no one was free until everyone was free.
As you can see, the years leading up to the Civil War were filled with great excitement, momentous decisions, deeply held convictions, and ultimately, conflict. And that rich history is still very visible here in the Blackstone Valley. Matter of fact, there are two other important sites in the Underground Railroad in Rhode Island that I wanted to take you to. One in Pawtucket and one in Central Falls. Unfortunately, they no longer exist. I can't show you how the slaves were hid. I can't show you how they would have reached the transportation that would have taken them north to Canada. These important sites are no longer part of our history. One's a parking lot, and one's the site of an outlet service mart. It's unfortunate, but pieces of our history is slowly slipping through our fingers. It doesn't have to be. We all take a close look at those important sites in our community, like the Asa Waters Mansion behind me, and try to find a way to protect them and preserve them. We'll all be better off. So this has been Chuck Arning, ranger with the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor, telling you we'd like to see you in the valley.